Thank you, Jamie. That was very interesting. I was actually managing to listen to you, even though I've mentally preparing for my presentation. And I wanted to start off with saying Mark's introduction was very nice. Thank you. What I failed, I apparently failed to update the program organizers that as of 1st of January, I'm also covering the tiny region of South Asia, including India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, which has been a really exciting...
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It's double the amount of work, double the excitement as well. So I'm actually very pleased. And I've also moved to Singapore after 8 years in Jakarta. And in Singapore, I'm actually sitting for logistic reasons, and I'm sitting in a World Bank office where I'm surrounded by lead financial specialists and controllers and lots of people having a lot to do with money, and then I'm covering water and sanitation for the poor. So my lunch conversations have actually changed because fecal sludge management and open defecation don't sit well with everybody. They don't share the enthusiasm over lunch. And so I've been trying hard to work on evidence and other things that people can actually relate to, and I think I've done it for good now. Last Friday, I was at the Bill and Melinda Gates-funded Reinvent the Toilet Fair in India, and in a weak moment, I had this picture taken of me, and I'm officially now, and it's been tweeted, so I'm done. I'm done for good. I'm really hoping that I don't have followers in Singapore for this. Let me get back to the actual topic that I was asked to talk about, and it is about urban water and sanitation and the sustainability of those services. So really this keynote is about sustaining urban water and sanitation services. It's not about infrastructure, it is about service provision to people and why these services still need to work in 2030. Pick 2030, pick 2050, it doesn't really matter. It's longevity of services that I would like to talk about. And I don't want to bore you too much with urbanization trends, but I think a few figures are, and my own retention span for figures is not very great. So I'll give you only a few. In 1950, 1/3 of the world population lived in urban areas. By the millennium, it was already half. And by 2050, it will be 2/3, or 6 billion people. The growth we have seen in urban areas in the last 200 years will double in the next 40 or 50. And most of this will happen in low and middle income countries, where in fact by 2020, 80% of the world urban population will live in those countries. And approximately 2.3 billion people will move into cities within just the next 4 decades, and those people will need services. Now, urbanization does come at a price in terms of human development, because while most poor people today still live in rural areas, that is changing. Some countries already have, like Brazil or Indonesia, Philippines, have about a quarter of their poor people in urban areas. Other countries are at 10%, but by and large, that is definitely changing. And by 2030, you could expect 2 million people living in slums. And peri-urban areas grow by about 18 million people per year. So that's almost the size, the entire population of Australia moving into slums each year. The big question then is, can cities and will cities actually cope with this? And cities and towns do attract people from rural areas for good reasons. They think they will get better jobs, they will get better job opportunities, education opportunities for their children. They will get better access to services, and they will ultimately have a safer and perhaps less stressful and maybe longer life. And that is true for people who move into what we call the mainstream urban areas, where they have services. But it isn't necessarily true for those who move into informal settlements. And cities who cope with a mix of population increase, global competitiveness, floods, rising inequity, and resource constraints actually can't cope as of now with this influx of people coming into the areas. And this is why, for example, in Africa, it is estimated that about 70% of the urban population in African cities actually lives in informal settlement with deficient services. Cities are by and large not coping because decision makers aren't adapting fast enough. This is a different time where the conventional mode of infrastructure project building isn't going to work anymore. I was quite encouraged, actually, to attend the toilet fair in India this week, because on Saturday we had a roundtable including a lot of state officials, and some of them were actually really pretty much down to earth. They had come from wishful thinking to pragmatically saying, we're not going to put centralized sewage systems into all our cities, we just can't. We need to think about different modes of delivery. So it was quite interesting and encouraging to hear that from state officials. I do think they are still the exceptions. We hear that from some, but we don't hear that from many. By and large, city officials still expect that they can serve the same systems, piped water supply into every home, and centralized sewage system in there, and that's what they aspire to and plan to. And this is unrealistic in relation to limited water supplies and water networks and capital and operational budgets. The infrastructure project mode also leads to, as we all know, a cycle of build, break, rebuild, break, rebuild again, hope that it holds this time. So one example from Ghana and West Africa is here, where the sewage network, the sewage works functioned for exactly 6 months after they were handed over. And they were rehabilitated some years later with yet another donor funding and failed again after a few months. And the sewer system upstream doesn't serve all users that it could, and a significant amount of sewage escapes through leakage, overflowing manholes, and broken down pump stations. So it's nothing specific to Ghana. It is something that we see over and over again. So what should be done? And do we actually know how to do it differently? Do we know how to serve the urban poor? And do we need poor inclusive or pro-poor strategies? And we've had a pretty heated debate, and we continue to have that within the World Bank. As you know, our president has adopted 2 new goals. One is to eradicate extreme poverty, and the other one is to cater to the bottom 40% in each country. And that debate has just intensified. Is it poor inclusive or is it pro-poor? And I think within our team, at least, we come to the realization that there isn't an either-or. You actually need both. And let me explain that a little bit. First of all, why poor inclusive? In the urban environment, the high population density increases the intensity of exposure to pollution, including shit, created by others, rich and poor. So fecal waste and flies don't discriminate. And if you are familiar with recent research that Dean Spears has been doing from the Rice Institute, he's calling it a double threat of open defecation and high population density. The denser the population, the more it matters whether your neighbor A has a toilet, whether your neighbor B uses that toilet, and separates for everybody's benefit the feces from the environment. If you look at the picture behind me, this is the city of Banjarmasin in Indonesia. The purple areas that you see here is where poor people live, and are also the informal settlements, that have been identified as the most high risk in terms of environmental sanitation. So as a policymakers, if you don't deal with them, and you see that some of them are straight on the river, if you don't deal with them, how do you think you will keep the river from being polluted? How do you think you will serve the rest of your population if you close your eyes to these and kind of hope that somebody else will take care of these? Now, there is a certain amount of protection that wealthier people in the city can help themselves with. They can buy bottled water. They can keep the compounds within their live fairly clean. They can have their children play inside only. They can use air cons and flies. They can do a lot of things. But if your nearby neighbor discharges fecally contaminated waste into open drains and your kids have nowhere else to play, what can you actually do? And if your neighbor takes water illegally from the piped system because he or she doesn't have any other choice, the non-revenue water that the utility is having to deal with will affect you and will affect your bill. Poor inclusive does not necessarily mean equal services for all. And this is perhaps where we encounter the most mental blockage vis-a-vis cities officials that we meet. The standard answer is too expensive. It's too expensive, we can't do it. We can't do it for everyone. With very few positive exceptions that if you start thinking about what are some solutions that could work. Many cities still think that what you need to do is expand the piped water and sewage system, and then somehow you can expand that to the rest. But the rest, or the residual, currently not connected, ranges from something like 75% of the urban population in Senegal or India to 97 or even 98% in Indonesia. So the rest is the vast majority. And thinking that you could cover them with the same type of services that are currently reaching 2 to 3% of the population, it's just neither cost efficient. We calculated, for example, that in India, connecting households to sewage system costs about $380 per household. If you were to upgrade septic management and make that safe, it's about $20 per household. So if you stick with the first system, it would be very expensive and it would take decades. And that's what we're seeing right now. It takes decades to expand those systems. In the meantime, the rest, the big rest, the majority, keeps being ignored. The limited sewage systems does very little to actually change the environment and help public health. And pipes, pumps, and treatments are actually dysfunctional or underused because you're actually not maximizing their utility. Government spending on those systems is actually pretty inequitable. If you look at data from, for example, Dar es Salaam, they spent 99% of the sanitation budget on sewage for 10% of the population. And even in Papua New Guinea, 60% of the national urban and water and sanitation budget is spent for sewage for 10% of the population. So I don't want to sound as if I'm against piped water systems or against centralized sewage system. I really want to make very sure that that's not what I'm trying to say. They can be cost effective, and they are in high density areas and towns, and sort of a backbone of those systems in cities is actually beneficial to have, if you can. But my point is more that practical and affordable and sustainable poor inclusive sanitation strategies are needed for everyone, which then gets me to the point of pro-poor approaches. Second point, why pro-poor? Pro-poor approaches are needed because in those areas where most of the poor people live, these communities have different needs. They, in many cases, do not own the land they live on. They live in rented and overcrowded houses and rooms. They live on marginal land that is unsafe, frequently flooded, very steep, very rocky, all the difficult parts of a town where nobody else wants to live. That's where you find a lot of these settlements. They lack security, especially women and girls, and there isn't enough space to actually build a lot. So these issues mean that it's often just not possible to serve them using the conventional water utility models with standard pipes and pit solutions, where the assumption is you own the house and you have some land tenure. Policymakers in many countries tend to think then, well, let's just do some community action. Let the community take care of this. But as we know, especially for urban areas, that there isn't the magic bullet of communities taking care of everything for themselves. The systems are more complex. They need to be somehow connected in the wider urban service delivery. You may have less social cohesion because some of these areas are people coming in from all sides. You haven't been living there for 300 years and many, many generations. And when we undertook a review, for example, in Indonesia of decentralized wastewater treatment system in poor urban areas, we did find that actually communities did quite well in terms of maintaining the systems. They wanted them, they liked them, they kept them clean above ground. Underground, desludging didn't happen, major repairs didn't happen. It was just too much for them. It was too expensive, and they didn't have the technical capacities. So the idea of management by communities really, in our view, has to change to something like co-management with government and clear definitions of who should do what in the future, rather than dumping it all on communities. Urban utilities, I don't want to only give bad news. Urban utilities around the world are showing that service provision to the poor is possible. And I want to give you a few examples. In Manila, in the Philippines, and in Nairobi, Kenya, you do have small-scale retailers who buy bulk water from the water utility and then formally sell it on in large and small containers or even small-scale piped networks to households. And that way, sort of getting out of the problem of land tenure, that utilities in some cases are just not allowed to serve houses where their land ownership isn't clear. And these systems, by and large, work, and they pay directly to the retailers, and they enable the poor to make flexible financial arrangements with these providers. So that's working quite well. In many Brazilian municipalities, low-cost sewage is provided for unplanned settlements by water and sanitation utilities, and in some cases for over 30 years. In India, Ghana, and Indonesia, you have tens of thousands of households in dense urban communities that are served with pretty well-maintained, shared community toilet, washing, bathing blocks, and simplified decentralized community sewer systems. And there are models of emerging small-scale fecal waste removal that are coming up in South Asian, Southeast Asian, and also African cities that are quite encouraging. What we don't see much yet is scale. With the exception of Brazil, where you really see quite large, cities being covered with those systems, we do have a lot of small examples with potential, but not much that is implemented citywide or even nationally. I think part of the problem is that we kind of tend to think, we and our partners tend to think about scaling up as an afterthought. So you do your pilot, and you kind of hope that at some point, if it's successful, you can think about scaling up. But a much more realistic strategy would be to think about that while you're starting your pilot. And you need to balance the best fit technology with the affordability and both human and financial capital constraints, and make sure that you find the best fit solution that doesn't work for 200 households, but works for thousands and millions in many countries. For the Pacific, more thousands. For South Asia, more millions. But and have a clear pathway of how you're going to get from one to another, and not build that in once you're done with the pilot. Cities that have shown the way have been very pragmatic, have had very pragmatic policymakers who are open to a variety of avenues of trying out different types of service provision. They acknowledge, all of them say, building the infrastructure is the piece of cake. That's the easy part. What is difficult is really deciding what type, what is the cost structure, how are we going to, is it possible to upgrade, what are the best systems to choose, and in other words, they have really thought about the whole enabling environment that needs to be in place for them to actually provide those services over the long time. So enabling environment is a term that a lot of us use, and it sounds very sexy, and it's just a way of saying, for some of us, it's just a way of saying that you need to think about many parameters of policy before you actually and can provide services, and that is looking at the continuity, the responsible agencies that have a local presence, accountability mechanisms, predictable budgets, if it's tariffs or something else, a reliable cash flow. All of these things have to come together. And to achieve long-term sustainability and equity to 2030 and beyond, we really need national policies that are poor inclusive, effective institutional frameworks, and regulation with accountability, and planning at applicable citywide or national levels, not just piloting. It doesn't really mean that governments need to provide all of that. I think an enabling environment also makes clear that others can be encouraged to provide services. Private sector, NGOs, local versus central government, utilities, a number of them. And the smarter cities have actually involved everyone who they think could provide those services. So what do I want to leave you with at this point? And I think there are a few points, four points that I think are important to keep in mind to kind of change the mindset of how we think about service provision versus infrastructure. Think service delivery and not infrastructure construction. I think I've made that very clear. Sustainable really means moving from infrastructure to a service delivery approach. Creating service markets where you can, and where these markets can't work by themselves, ensure public funding is available to kind of help market failures. Plan for operation and not for building only. Plan for who will keep the systems running and who will fix them when they break, rather than just the opening ceremony, the ribbon cutting. Think poor inclusive and pro-poor. Not a very nice, not very easy to say, but both of it is important. Poor people need to be part of a citywide plan of what you're going to deliver, but still look at whether you need specific approaches and policies to serve those particular areas. And then think national scale and not slum upgrading pilot. Do the back of the envelope math of how you're going to serve the whole urban population that is currently unserved in a country, and develop a pathway to get there while you're designing your first pilot for 100 houses. And talk to everyone about the big dream rather than that little pilot, because that's really what's going to be changing the way urban services are currently delivered. Thank you.